everyone, and welcome to Pharmaceutical Soccer, the longest running soccer show in town and proud partner of 615soccer.com. This is Valer Shabila, and I'm joined by Clay Trainum. Usually, I'm not the one doing the hosting, so it's a little bit of a special episode with a special guest. So we kicked Steven off for this week and replaced him with one of the most prominent voices in North American soccer, the mind behind the Goss theorem, the effort behind Soccer Wise, and most importantly, Big J journalist David Goss. Welcome to the pharmacy.
What an intro. What a setup. That feels hard to live up to. So I'm just going to say, hey, thanks for having me.
Not only was it a great intro, I didn't know it was coming because I was about to start, and then he just took it.
Listen, I told you I'm running it.
Yeah, just caught me off guard.
Listen, they always say in times of flux, when a leader is lost, that's when it's the best time to force a coup. So,
that is the
Blair, I appreciate the work.
That's the kindest thing anyone has ever said about Steven.
I have to tell you, David. Sam Stejskal called this the best drugstore in MLS. This show, so I'm looking for a similar soundbite. If you got anything, okay, we'll just clip it and get it over the line.
Okay, I'll work on it. Now, Sam is an actual capital J journalist because he went to Northwestern, which is an elite journalism program. I went to Northeastern, which is most famous for being confused with Northwestern. So I don't have as big of a capital J as Sam, but I'll try my best to try and match him.
Thank you.
It's all right. Northwestern alumni are only worried about Mizzou anyway.
I'm not getting into the journalism wars. I don't need to have Syracuse people in my mentions talking college basketball now.
All I know is that I went to MTSU because it was close, as we discussed earlier.
Go Blue Raiders.
That's it. Yes. That's a good soundbite right there. But no, guys, thank you so much for joining us. You know, we're big fans, Clay and I, of course, and I think a lot of people in Nashville have been listening to you, watching you, whether it was calling games or obviously with your podcast and shows and all that. So it's a real honor to have you on here. And I think for us, for me personally, when Nashville got awarded the MLS franchise, I was very unfamiliar with MLS. So I got into MLS listening to Extra Time for the most part. And I said something on socials when the news came out and everything. And then, you know, for you, Andrew Eby, and obviously Matt Doyle as well, all three of you guys were important to me because I knew soccer. I was very familiar with the game of soccer. I didn't know American soccer at all. I didn't even watch the national team. And you know, we're talking 6 years later, and I'm an MLS sicko subscribing to all these things. So that's thanks to you guys. So thanks. I just want to get that off to start with.
I just want to shout out Lawless and Borg because I was a sicko before Nashville had a team. I was a resident nerd on this show.
Me and Clay met at a USL game. He traveled up to watch Nashville USL against Red Bulls 2, which I used to call, which was like one of my favorite jobs I've ever had. And that's where we met. You gave me a Nashville t-shirt, I believe, which I still have as my Nashville thing.
Nice. Well, only thing I really remember from that game is I got cussed out by the Red Bulls goalkeeper.
Yeah. It's like, Red Bull legacy there. Red Bull 2 goalkeepers are blue collar. They're down and dirty.
Well, then the Red Bulls scored, and then he ran over to me and apologized for cussing at me.
And I know you're a big fan of Brandon Allen. We got to watch him here in Nashville for a year, so there's that too.
Yeah, whores and goals.
So we like to know, you know, like a little bit about yourself. I don't know how much you get chance to talk about yourself and your sort of soccer journey and sort of coverage, but like, how did you even get into this? It's so niche, especially at the time you were doing it, you know, to get into soccer. It's still very niche to get into soccer, I feel like, especially in the journalism media world. So like, what got you into that?
I think I started playing a little bit later than most kids in the US. Like we, you know, as doing what we do, we always talk about all the stats of like, it's the highest played sports by children, all of that. I didn't start until like end of middle school into high school. And so I think there was a more conscious experience for me of like, why am I doing this and what do I like about it? I love geography, history, learning about cultures, all of that. So that part of soccer all of a sudden immediately connected with me. And my other sport is basketball, which I actually think the two sports are really similar when you talk about like movement in space and the influence of a coach versus the influence of a player and individuality and all those types of things. So it was a really easy like pickup for me. And then once I picked it up, it exploded in my life and it became the most central part probably of my life. And I, started watching European soccer first, but for me, where I was in New York, living in a really multicultural area, like all of a sudden it was Telemundo Liga MX games on Saturday night and watching Copa Libertadores at the bodega and when it was on in the background and learning about the Guatemalan national team and like all of that I really became fascinated by. And very quickly I became a fan of the US national team. And so from the US national team, I went backwards into MLS, which I don't know is the direction everyone always goes in, but I think that's probably the hope for people who work in Major League Soccer and sort of try and build the whole system. And I was already a fan of really bad sports teams because I'm a New Yorker and I picked all the loser ones. So I wasn't like looking for a team. So the national team became my team and I just watched based off who those players were. So I started watching the league front to back immediately. And I think from that moment, there was a lot of ownership. And I think you guys will feel the same of it's so small that you feel like you can be involved and you can affect it and you can understand it. 30 teams is insane. I'm working on our season previews right now. And it's like, God damn it. But back in the day, it was like I could rattle off the starting lineup of now I still can because it's what I do, but I could rattle off the starting lineup of every MLS team because there was 15 or 16 of them. And it was easy to sort of like follow it and get connected to it. So that became my passion. I realized I wasn't very good at sports, so I wanted to go into broadcasting. And I kind of always knew that was the direction I wanted to take. And it has changed a bit. You said like it's still a little niche. I think it's less so. Obviously, most people get into it through Premier League and La Liga and Champions League and all that type of stuff. I've always been frustrated by the fact that most of my work environments are people who want to be working baseball and basketball and football who are looking for whatever work they can get. But that has changed more. I think I'm in less rooms or less broadcast setups where people don't care about the product and don't spend any effort on it. Like there was a long time when I first started and tried to break in and I'd meet people and they'd be like, yeah, like, I work the Columbus Blues games. So then I don't know why I picked Columbus because I don't know anyone in Columbus, but I picked a random sports team. I mean, I was based in Boston for a while and the Revs were an afterthought. Brad Feldman, of course, doing all the games and a legend. And he's obviously super involved. But outside of that, like no one else really cared. And then in New York, Metro Stars becoming the Red Bulls and even NYCFC, they are all afterthoughts. Like they are smaller market experiences. So I think I always wanted to be someone who cared about this thing the way other people care about other leagues, because I think that helps fans sort of feel the same. And so Tom says it best on our show every once in a while when it comes up, but like this is all, I mean, sports are silly, but like it's okay to care about your MLS team. It's okay to care about your NWSL team, which is a lot of what we cover as well. And I want people to feel like there are other people out there who are providing that coverage that I get about the NBA and NFL whenever I want it.
So I found the basketball point interesting. I actually come from a basketball background as well. I was a basketball manager in college for 4 years. And then you working in college sports, I was always around people, especially in PR, that wanted to cover basketball, but they have to cover, lacrosse before they can cover basketball, things like that. I think you were doing basketball games a few years ago. I don't know if you still are.
Yep.
And like, it was very funny. I was living with an assistant basketball coach at one point down in Texas. He hated soccer. He'd tell me every time he walked into the house, he was like, "Are you watching? I don't need to watch that." And so there was one day where he was actually home because basketball coaches are never home for dinner. And there was one day when he was actually home and he's like, "I'm going to sit down. I'm going to watch this." And so he sits down with a bowl of soup. And I was like, "You're a basketball coach. Just watch everything off the ball."
Yeah.
He sits there and he watches. About 5 minutes later, he goes, "I get it." And he got up and left.
Yeah.
And so it's like an interesting thing of like trying to find people to see it the same way that they see this other thing and bringing them in. But I do feel like it used to be when I'd walk in and do stats at I do stats on the side for all of these colleges, and I'd walk in wearing like a soccer jacket or something like that. I would get like, "What?" And now it's, "Oh, who's your team?" "Oh, like I watch this team." And it used to be like not like that at all. So it's definitely a change that I've seen, especially among sports fans around the country, there's MLS pulls from a lot of like like they're not fans of other sports. They're just fans
Mhm.
of soccer or they're fans of MLS and nothing else. But I'm starting to see it the last maybe 10 years. I would walk into like an athletic department and I wouldn't be the only soccer guy or the designated office soccer guy to explain the World
Yeah.
Cup every 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the reality of soccer in America is it will always be pulling from different places because it's so different from the establishment. And so you're always going to have people who are like, I don't really like sports, but I like the community aspect of being a supporter of a club, or I like the social aspect of being a supporter of a club. There's a lot of social responsibility that comes from soccer because the sport is built out of clubs, which are for communities, not built from corporations down originally. We're getting there. Don't worry. We're very, very close, if not through that. So I think there's always going to be elements of fans who like that type of stuff. There's always going to be people who maybe play soccer but don't like to watch sports, and so that's a way in for them. But I definitely think we've reached the point where you turn on Sports Center and the bottom line will always have a soccer stat, right? Whether it's EPL or Bundesliga, most of it's because ESPN owns that league, like the rights to that league or whatever. But that stuff wasn't happening 10 years ago, and it wasn't happening 5 years ago. And MLS and NWSL have broken into a few of those spaces sometimes. That's a conversation we can have, whether there's enough happening there and whether there's good or bad. But I think for sure it has shifted from I am, a Dallas Cowboys fan. It's like I'm a Dallas Cowboys and a Chelsea fan. I'm not like stoked to talk about Chelsea all the time, but at least it's a doorway in to now say, oh, you like this team? Do you remember Wilfred Zaha? He now plays in MLS. Like there are just more doors to a lot of those things. And I absolutely agree with you. I spent a long time being the only one or
Yeah.
being the soccer guy. And like everyone had to say it with the hard phrase. And I think a lot of that has gone away. And the basketball stuff is fun. Like you talk about the off ball stuff, it's a backdoor cut, whether it's Andy Nahar cutting it, going into the channel behind a left winger who's ball watching on Walker Zimmerman's foot, or it's a point guard on the top of a key hitting a cutter from the side of, from coming in from the side. Like all of that is the same. A lot of it is very similar. And so I find them very easy connections. That's also my debate point when people are like, what if our best athletes played soccer? And it's like, it's not about Kevin Garnett. It's about all the backup point guards in college basketball who could be wingers and tens and eights and all this type of stuff. It's also a numbers game at that point. But I've always really enjoyed using that. And I think we're seeing a world now where there's so much sharing across all these sports. Like, one of the huge storylines around Gareth Southgate was how much they looked at the San Antonio Spurs inbounds plays for their set pieces. Because there's a lot of knowledge you can share across a lot of these athletics.
Yeah, especially with like all the teams that are owned by similar organizations or
Mm-hmm.
have some sort of connection. And we'll get to Nashville SC in a second, but I do want to say from just to kind of reiterate that point. I mean, I moved to Americans 16 years ago, and I think the sort of desire and the demand for soccer was always there. I just think now it's coming a little bit more in the prominent
Yeah.
sort of mainstream, and a lot of it has to do with the internet and all that development and all that. But also it's still not to where I think we can get it to be, and I think we've seen from our standpoint, honestly, from 615 soccer or pharmaceutical soccer, we just launched a couple weeks ago 615 soccer, and the response to that caught us off all off guard. And I knew we had I knew we had people in our who have our back, who will put in their money and their support to kind of get this content that we create. But I think I underestimated the Nashville market in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, and going seeing that in front of me makes me really feel positive about what you're doing at soccer wise, or what others are doing out there from a national perspective. Because if we at a local level can get this sort of support, then that means there is appetite for it
Mhm.
higher up, and there's appetite for more national stuff. So with that said, like, I want to ask you, what has it been like starting soccer wise and creating this sort of partnership with Tom, and getting that MLS coverage that we all crave, almost daily MLS coverage that's just out there. And I mean, I was supported. I think day one you guys announced, because I was like, these guys, I know exactly what I'm gonna get out of them, and I know you guys do it NWSL stuff as well. I'm not as familiar with the league, but I try to listen every now and again on the NWSL side. So what has that been for you, and how has the reception been so far?
It's been great. I'm not sure that I would have expected it, and so that's been really promising. I think similar to your experience, like I believe in the work that I do, and I believe that in the energy that I put into that work. But some things are outside of your control, and I've constantly worked for larger organizations where it's like you work really hard, but a boss makes a decision and you move on, or you have these beliefs about what could work, and if the soul is there, what people will feel, but you're not sure how that will actually happen. And so it's been really exciting to get the feedback that we've gotten and the engagement that we've gotten. And I think a lot of the things that I was passionate about building, we have seen. We built this Discord community where people are talking about MLS and NWSL and USL and USL League One and talking about national teams 24 hours a day on that. And like that is something that I've always wanted to have. And so I'm not always the one talking. Like I'm just reading through and sort of just enjoying that an SKC fan can melt down in there when they sell off a DP or might get a DP that they don't want and have a place to do that with other people who understand what's going on. And I will say this every day. I think Reddit MLS is the best thing that's happened to MLS in such a long time. And I'm on there all the time. And I did an AMA there like last year. But besides that, like that's where I have always lived. And, Twitter disintegrating has not made it easier, I think, for soccer fans to connect. So stuff like that is stuff that I've always been passionate about building and believed in, but you don't actually know. And I think to your experience, like you put something to market, you don't know what it's going to be. And you also have to take ideas and passions and turn them into like tangible things that can work and be created. So that's been a huge process. There's been a lot of learning experiences for me, but I think it's been really positive to see how people have reacted and people have engaged. I've never covered NWSL as a job. Like I've just always been a fan. To me, it's the best league in the world. And there's nothing else in the United States that you can say is the best soccer league in the world. So I've always enjoyed covering it. I was supposed to actually intern in college at a team that the league collapsed the day that I was supposed to start. So I didn't start that day and didn't hear back for a little while. And that was not positive. And so I've always been around it. And, I've covered the college game on the women's side for most of my career and through school myself. And so that's been really, really fun for me. It's pushed me because I've had to learn. Like when you go from fan to covering, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, it's like you go from the like, oh, this player's good to like, oh, how do I tangibly understand where this player sits, where the salary cap hit is, what the value is of that international roster spot, what formation they can play, what's been the changes over. And so that's been really fun for me. And I met a lot of new people, which has been really cool because I love the MLS community and the USL community around. But it's a lot of similar people. So it's cool to expand and sort of get into there. And I host those shows with Jordan Angeli, who I've known forever. She covered Colorado Rapids and then the Columbus Crew, and she's hosted shows with me in the past remotely. I've done stuff on site with her. And so to be able to tap into her experience and knowledge and just get to work with her every week is really cool. And she started an expansion team, which got awarded the 16th spot in NWSL. And so I think it's good every once in a while to sit somewhere and be like, this person's better than me and cooler than me. And to be able to at least be like, okay, things are attainable if you put your mind to it and you do it. So it's been really cool to watch that happen. And like last week, she came back from vacation and I interviewed her to be like, what's it like to have started an expansion team, which is not something I'm ever going to do. So that was really fun as well.
Well, that expansion team might be a little bit of a sore topic here in Nashville
Yeah.
because one of the bids was Nashville. Now, to be fair, I don't think the Nashville bid was it. In my opinion, it wasn't as far advanced as the other ones out there. But I'll let the experts talk about that, I guess.
The word on the street had always been that the political momentum was behind a WNBA Nashville team and not an NWSL one.
The Summits?
Well,
Yeah,
and
you
then
see
that
that?
was announced, and it was the Haslams who also own the Crew. They're about to be the owners of the
Yeah.
Predators. If they're not already, they own the Browns. It makes sense why
Yeah.
the sort of push was behind WNBA, even though NWSL was operating over here as well.
And I'll throw this out there. I think the commissioner last week at the media day, we had Party Kotri on to talk on our show last week, who was there for CBS. She said that the commissioner said that they talked to around 80 different programs, 80, like bids and conversations. And the majority of them were not, we think we're going to get this. And the majority of them were like, we want to start a conversation. I don't know what NWSL's expansion plans are. I find it interesting when people are worried about expansion in soccer, because to me, there's an endless amount of good soccer players. Like expansion in the NBA is a problem. There's 7 superstars. There's, 37 good players. Like there's a limit there. There's no limit in soccer. Like there are players everywhere. You have to open up international roster spots and all of that. And also when you open those spots up, you're going to then bring people into markets who are going to play with young players who are going to get better. So I know NWSL doesn't want to do it wrong. I think it's smart to have steady growth, but I'd be shocked if Cleveland and Cincinnati and Nashville and Miami and Atlanta and all these cities that seemed like they were close, I'd be shocked if in 10 years, all of them didn't have teams.
Well, I mean, we've talked about that on the show a lot. I mean, there were 3 pre-professional teams in Nashville last year, which is like a pretty crazy number
Right.
for this area. And so, and obviously women's soccer, like if there's an endless supply of players in men's soccer, there's absolutely an endless supply of players in women's soccer because honestly, unfortunately, there's not as many pro opportunities that are afforded to them. And so like it's all a good thing, I think. I mean, that's a whole different show.
We already doubled the time we had allotted, so good start.
So we made that's a pet topic of mine.
Great.
My wife was a college soccer player, and I go to the pre-professional games all around here. So like I'm really into it. But
shout out to Nashville
but let's
Rhythm.
talk about Nashville. So
Nashville Rhythm. Right?
Nashville, yeah, let's talk about Nashville Rhythm. Let's talk about Tennessee soccer. No. So it's funny, like before we recorded, and I'm not gonna say the exact wordings, but it's easy to see that Nashville SC was kind of an afterthought nationally after the last maybe 6 to 8 months have played out. And honestly, at times it felt like a little bit of an afterthought in here. I mean, we had an interim coach for 13 games last season for some reason. So we're kind of just curious because locally we've seen as big a changeover as you can see happen within a team without losing any DPs.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are kind of in our own bubble, especially now that we have our own media company. So we don't really know like what the view is outside of Nashville, other than what the occasional like drops and pieces that we see. So like, what is kind of your view on Nashville, being someone who has to cover the whole league?
I think it's this is the biggest revolution in Nashville since the team came into Major League Soccer. It has been the club of steady, slow and steady wins the race. And all of a sudden it's changed. New head coach, the biggest piece of that. And yet for an MLS team, it is almost as stable an offseason as you could possibly have. And so it's like these two opposing forces going at each other. And I think if you have this conversation with me in 15 minutes, again, I might say like, oh yeah, Nashville, same as always. Like, let me see, I'm not going to change my mind until you prove it. But right now I'm like, well, it's also the revolutionary club of like a new coach, maybe some level of a new system, new central midfield, like a bunch of new pieces that are filling in roles that haven't had new pieces in a really long time for this team. So I think it goes between the two. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think having stable pieces and like being able to make the life easier of other players as you come into a league or come into a team to say like Hani Mukhtar is a known quantity and like I know what I'm going to get, and Walker Zimmerman and Jack Mayer and guys like that. I think that's like a positive in Major League Soccer. But Nashville has bumped its head up against it feels like its limit in MLS. And right now the question is there anything in this club that is a force multiplier that can change that ceiling? And the big one is being BJ Callahan. I think BJ Callahan, similar to like having two opposing views, BJ Callahan is a very obvious candidate to be a head coach in Major League Soccer. I also don't know anything about BJ Callahan as a head coach. We learned a little bit over the course of the season, but like that is also one of those things where the moment he got announced, you're like, that makes sense. And if someone asks why, you're like, can't really tell you why, but that does make sense.
Were you surprised? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Clint.
I was just going to say the thing that I've said on here multiple times is like the assistant from the U.S. national team is always a top candidate in MLS. Now, is he Anthony Hudson or is he Jesse Marsh or somewhere in between? You don't really know how it's going to shake out. But with BJ, I guess because of the experience with the Union and also with the national team, working with a guy who definitely understands how to win games in MLS and how to maximize maybe roster constraints. Especially so when Greg Berhalter was at Columbus, maybe that gives him a little bit more of a solid footing than someone who wasn't as familiar. But yeah, it's a weird thing, and I say on here, there's always going to be a lot with BJ. There's going to be a lot of on the job learning. Like there's things that he's going to do that are really well that Nashville hasn't seen. There's also going to be some mistakes that he's going to make because he hasn't been a head coach before.
Yeah.
Were you surprised like Nashville went for sort of took a flyer on a guy like that rather than go for like a Gio Savarese or someone with like more MLS experience going from Gary Smith to BJ Callahan?
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty dramatic change.
So on the one hand, I'd say no, because when you look at a roster that's kind of set and a system that's kind of set, a wild variance on a coach is a way to change that, right? So let's talk, and their team has flipped more recently, but like look at Minnesota. Minnesota went from Adrian Heath, DPs locked in, spine locked in. We knew Minnesota was going to be in this 4-point spread or 6-point spread every year. So how do you change that? Because it's tough to flip a roster in Major League Soccer, and it's tougher to do so, especially when those DPs are locked in, the coach. And so they went for Eric Ramsey, and that was like, it could hit or it could bomb, but that sort of changes your calculus. BJ Callahan, I think, feels a little different in that because he has that experience around the American game and has those connections, it feels like a safer pick. But specifically, I did think Gio Savarese was a really good match for Nashville. And I don't think Gio's a perfect match everywhere. I love Gio as a human being, and like I would sit with him and talk soccer any day of the week. And I think he would be good at a lot of MLS clubs. Nashville felt like a really good fit for him because he has the ability to get one more 0.5% or one more iota out of experienced players. And Nashville is not churning out academy talent, and they're not pushing 17-year-olds into the starting lineup. How do you get a little bit more from Gaston Brugman? How do you get a little bit more from Shaq Moore? Guys like that are what Gio Savarese has done really well. So I just thought in the moment, it felt like the right fit. And so that's where my mind was at. And then when BJ Callahan got announced, I was shocked right there because I didn't know that he would be that high up on the list. And then pretty quickly you start to assess and say, like you said, national team assistant's always going to be on a list. Had worked as an interim, so had a little bit of head coaching experience then, and has been around American soccer for such a long time and has crossed paths, I assume, very heavily with the people who are in charge, the Mike Jacobs of the world and all of that. And so these are people who have probably talked soccer for 20, 30 years. And when you have someone that you think has similar ideas or interesting ideas, now you have the opportunity to bring them in.
Yeah, and I think they were pretty intentional about how they wanted to switch from this idea of Nashville being within that 6-point sort of spread, like you were talking about Minnesota. I mean, Mike Jacobs has been marketing this as a Nashville SC 2.0 from the end of last year. So there's a clear initiative from both the front office and the coaching staff and the players about they use words like writing chapter 6 and stuff like that, which I get it is buzzwords. You got to get uniquely Nashville. We keep hearing that, right? And it's like, what does that really mean? What is that? And shout out Ben Wright, because he did ask BJ directly, like, what is uniquely Nashville? So go read that piece if you want to get an idea of that. But I think going into year 6 with Mike Jacobs with this front office. Now, Ali McKay did end up going to DC, so it's a little bit of a change, but nonetheless, the head guy is Mike Jacobs. He's been the general manager since the inception of this team in MLS. So, how do you rate this 5-year run by Mike Jacobs first, and then also where do you see it going forward if Nashville wasn't able to necessarily get a title in this and get any sort of cup success in this run?
I think you have to say it's been positive, like for an expansion team to come in and be competitive early on and even push into a Leagues Cup final and push into a couple playoff wins. I think overall, like if you presented that to a club and a fan base before it started, you would take that in a second. So you have to look back on that and remember that. I think something that it depends on a fan base and your experience. Sometimes fans love a stability and sometimes fans get frustrated by no ups and downs. And that consistency can get, I think Pittsburgh Steelers fans are having this conversation. I'm a Jets fan. We haven't made the playoffs in 14 years. Send me Mike Tomlin. You guys can do whatever you want. I'll take the appearance and lose. And so I think that's sort of where you go. One of the things I've said a lot is they have hit a lot of MLS moves out of the park. They've struggled with international moves. So the thing that Nashville SC's front office is good at, they are great at. The things they're not good at, they have struggled. And so, how can you add something to the system or to the process to just get you a little bit better at those other elements? One of the things I think will be really interesting over the next few years, however this goes, is I do think some of the rule changes might actually help Nashville SC. One of them being the cash for trade that's come up. And we just saw Dejan Joveljic be the first one that SKC purchased inside the league. So now there's another mechanism for Nashville to make even bigger MLS acquisitions. And I think that's a club where right now, maybe they're struggling to go to ownership and say, give us $6 million to go pay for this player who's playing in the Austrian Bundesliga that we know will be good in MLS. But it seems easier to then go and say, this guy scored 15 goals in MLS last year. He'll score at least 15 goals for us in MLS this year. Let's make that move. And so I think Nashville can sit in a really interesting place now. And all of these rules excite me because I think it allows clubs to have some versatility in the way they choose to roster build, which is something that has at moments gotten stale in MLS of like everyone's following the same model and whoever got the better Argentine number 10 is the better team. And I think Nashville can fit in a really clean place coming forward.
And I think that makes us in a special amount of sense for Nashville, given Nashville's spending is actually pretty high among the league. Unfortunately, it's because they've had to buy out a lot of failed international projects over the years, but it certainly makes a whole lot more sense that Nashville could be among the highest spenders and spend it within the league and work. I do think, and we've talked a lot about Mike Jacobs in the last probably year and a half of this show. The challenge, and the challenge really started last year, but the challenge that he's had the last year and a half is this is the first time he's been in a situation to turn over, to move the page, or turn the page, to get to how do you rebuild when you don't have a clean slate. Like, he did a really good job of establishing the foundation. The only problem with establishing the foundation, it was a bunch of people in their 30s.
Yeah.
Which, as someone in their 30s, like, hey, I'm glad to see it. But but on the other
we've got
hand,
so much promise left in our lives. We have so much more to give.
Yeah. So like it's a really interesting question that I think is still an open question because he is, I mean, it's not like some of the guys that have been signed this offseason are particularly young. So
yeah.
We will see. There's some interesting international signings, obviously, coming into Nashville. So we will see on that front. But I do wonder about what the ceiling is, not necessarily for Nashville, but on the front office as it is. Like, will he be someone who stays in a long place and just like continually turns over the team? Because he was under Peter Vermes, who has done that. Or is he going to be the expansion maestro, like get a guy
and goes to the next expansion job?
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting question on what's next if he doesn't turn this team over.
Yeah, it's I think for sure. We just watched the Grammys yesterday, right? There's some great artists who spent 17 years of their lives building up music to create one album, and then a year and a half later they've got to flip into a second album, and like that's not what everyone's great at. Clearly there was a lot of ideas he had coming into Nashville that it was like, this is how I put a team together, and then you get to do it. And now, as you said, you've got to redo it, and you've got to shift some of it. And I think in the Gaston Bruggeman move, you see sort of going back to the original idea, but doing it with new pieces, right? He is a very Annabelle Godoy, Dax McCarty-like addition to a team. But then you see some of these younger pieces coming in. I do like some of the ideas that have occurred of Andy Nahar is going to give you something different, and he's going to give you 75% of Shaq Moore in other places at 1/8 millionth of the cost. And like, how do you start to shift the roster around to find different places where you're creating advantages? So can you find these players? And they did it well with Jacob Schaffelberg, who are giving you more value against the dollar to then go spend it in other places and find different pieces. I still think if you have a strong spine MLS team with Hani Mukhtar, you can go out and find difference makers who are not always consistent, but pieces. And if we're talking about Greg Berhalter, it's a great example. Go back to his crew teams. They were built on Ethan Finley and Justin Miram, who were college players that were on the bench when he took over. And he knew Pipa Higuain and Kai Kamara and Archer were good enough that their ability to change the game once every 90 minutes was enough because the floor was high. And so I think Nashville can be a team like that. I think it's funny we're having this conversation today because Johnny Russell just did an interview where he said, like, I'm going back. I'm going to go back to MLS. I'm talking to some teams. That's a no-brainer to me. Obviously, the connection with Mike Jacobs and SKC is there, but like Johnny Russell still has match-winning moments once every other game when he's healthy for the right team. I think Nashville's one of those teams where you can look around and say, we don't need to go out and get Thiago Almada. Like our floor is high enough that we can have 3 or 4 different match-winning moments in our group. And if we're just able to manage it correctly, put them in against the right opponent at the right time, that we can get victories. And I don't know the feeling in the fan base, but if this team wins a playoff game this year, it feels like that's going to be a really good year.
In like August or September, I wrote an article about the best free agents out there for Nashville to get, and I think Johnny Russell was like the second or third name I had on there. So that makes a lot of sense to me. They do have Benji Michel on trial right now with the team, so kind of not obviously Johnny Russell is a lot older, but just sort of more of a winger who can maybe tuck in, and kind of provide that same goal threat.
This is not nearly as important, but I do think it's worth noting. Valerius Chaldean, and you're the first person not named Valer to bring up Justin Miram, and I just want you to know that he absolutely appreciates that.
We
got our Rockies together. Come on.
I was sitting there like, be cool, be cool. There's a mention here. Yeah, no, it's Justin Miram is like one of 5 or 4 active. Well, he's no longer active, I guess. There's like only two or three, I guess, active Chaldean players from Iraq specifically. So we're a very small minority in Iraq, in America, anywhere else in the world. Probably less than 1 million people speak the language, so it's very, very tight knit.
There we go, and we hit one right here on this show.
Exactly, and I'm somehow in Nashville, Tennessee. So that's the beauty of MLS, I guess.
Yeah.
No, I mean that makes sense. One guy I do want to talk about that Nashville made a move for internationally, who looks to be the par for me seeing training and seeing the preseason game 2 days ago, is Edward Taxeth, and I think he's gonna be a really good motor for that midfield. And when you pair him with somebody like Patrick Yazbek, who came into Nashville kind of halfway through the last year, both came in from the Scandinavian leagues, which is where Hani Mukhtar came from. There seems to be a clear sort of eye towards those leagues. Their off seasons are similar to MLS, so it makes it easier to make these moves. I think Taxeth is going to bring something that others maybe others weren't able to create, whether it was Brian Anunga or Sean Davis last year. Yeah. Both of which I think are good players, good MLS quality players, but neither of them could do the forward-thinking stuff that BJ Callahan wanted them to do. And BJ's coming in with a new idea of how to play, and in terms of this team, he's going a lot more pressing than we've ever seen Nashville do. He's a lot narrower than we've ever seen Nashville do. And what we keep seeing through these preseason games and through training is the 4-2-2-2 sort of setup, which Philadelphia Union has done for years, whether it's diamond or just the way it is. I guess with that sort of setup, it's not a Red Bull system where they're pressing every single minute of the game. But with that sort of setup and with the current roster that you see, are there needs that jump out at you when you see this roster?
I think as you talk through, I do like the central midfield moves. I think they've gotten more athletic, and I think they've gotten more well-rounded in those positions. So I think coming into the year coming into the offseason, that was the big position, flashing at you. And I think the 2 moves they've made in bringing in Brugman and Taxeth plus having Yazbek already in the fold, I think that's probably the work done there. And Brian Acosta, who we all wish, but isn't going to happen, fine for a game or two, but it is what it is at this point. Colorado already tried that. I think that area was the big area of need coming into the offseason. I think that's been filled. I've mentioned Nahar a couple times. I'm excited to see him again. He's MLS lifer, and I do think he changes the shape a little for them because Shaq Moore liked to stay so wide and was, how much of it was Gary Smith telling him, stay wide, hit crosses, how much of that is who he is. But either way, to save money and get Nahar, I think is a really big bonus for this team. So then the questions are just on the wing, and not on the wing, whatever the setup is, but it is those quote unquote wide attacking players and players who can change the game. What Jonathan Perez gave a little bit last year. Schaffelberg has some of that in his game. And so I think those are the spots. That's the spot where you're still looking and saying, who can you bring in? And like I've talked about, this team is so settled that it could be a group that like, can you go get someone on loan who's in the wrong situation and it's just through June for now? Like you don't need to go out and spend 12, because you're not going to spend $12 million on the right player. But can you bring in a couple different elements to give Callahan a couple different options to figure out what's the right fit or what's the need or what's the profile that you need? And I think there's a little bit of flexibility in this roster to add into those positions, hence the Johnny Russell connection. And that would kind of be it. A lot of this group is settled, and there's positive and negative with that. But I think for now, you have to think of it as a positive to be able to go forward. And I'm excited to watch this midfield. Like, I think when you look at MLS and you look at the way the league works, and to be able to have pieces in midfield like that, and it's not going to be like Houston because Ache was a different piece. But when you look at Artur and Coco and players like that, like, can you bring elements of that? Fully well-rounded players who want the ball under pressure, who are able to get out on the half turn. And when they do, they're able to chew up ground and run at pace and start to force defenders to make decisions, as well as their ability to press off the ball and get you into the attack quickly. And there's a lot of great teams that have been able to be built on aspects like that. And those players aren't always best 11 world-class players, but you're able to use their skill sets in the right way on your team. And I think that's what Nashville wants to be.
Just really quickly, the one guy we haven't mentioned yet from a Nashville perspective that will make your Red Bull hearts happy. Alex Muyl was the best white player Nashville had under BJ Callahan. And even though Jacob Schaffelberg was killing on the Canadian national team, I mean, Alex Muyl was the guy for BJ Callahan. So just more of a sort of kind of proves what you're saying, is that it doesn't have to be that earth-shattering guy. Alex Muyl, with all due respect, he's not the $12 million signing, but the work he's doing under BJ Callahan in that system has earned him so many good opportunities, and he's taken most of them, to be fair, with goals and assists.
And Timothy Chalamet could just give him $12 million. So
yeah,
they don't need
that. Although I appreciate that Timothy Chalamet still calls him Mule.
Yeah.
But that was to bring that up, to force the other team to make a mistake is something that we've talked about specifically on this show so many times. So like when Hani Mukhtar is all you have, and Nashville several times in their however many years, that's been the case. And when you start to add, whether that is when he was healthy, Randa Leal, taking a shot from 30, that forces teams to make decisions. And I am very excited about this midfield coming together, not just in like holding the ball and maybe settling things down, but also getting forward a little bit, forcing teams to commit to something. Because one thing you can say about MLS that you could say about MLS 15 years ago is that people will make mistakes defensively. Goals are there for the taking. And a lot of times over the last couple of years with Nashville, it has been someone has to make a mistake, and they have to make a mistake while Hani Mukhtar has the ball. Yeah. Like that is, and so spreading that out a little bit and not just solely depending on, someone tall getting on a cross on the off chance that Hani doesn't have the ball, like that just gives you a little bit more confidence that you're going to have more to play with, because money in MLS is limited, which means you spend money where people are most attracted to, which is on the attacking side of the ball. So it is there for the taking if you challenge teams defensively.
And I think one of the big things for Nashville to say what can be this 2.0 or chapter 6 or whatever buzz term we got in there at the end that we landed on is just having a curveball. Like it's been one style for such a long time that it becomes predictable for opponents to figure out how to game plan for it. And so you don't get thrown off. And you said there's a lot of mistakes in Major League Soccer. They're out there. Very often it comes from we thought they'd come out and sit deep and they pressed us early, or the other way around. And that's an ability for teams to change their shape And in doing that, change what teams expect. And you can do it over the course of a game. And that's one of the things that Wilfred Nancy always, or that Columbus players always talk about with Wilfred Nancy is like, I think Christian Ramirez was talking to us and saying like, they're able to change shape within the game multiple times, which I was not something I was familiar with because these players are so well coached and there are so many different ideas. And so I think having that for Nashville is a really big element that can help them take another step and steal some more points this year.
So, apologies, as it seems we may have lost Valaire for a moment, but let's we're talking a little bit in platitudes, like what is going to, if this works out, how does this go? What do you establish as the bar as like a realistic expectation from a national perspective? Like I said, we're in a bit of a bubble, so we can't totally gauge, what's going on a micro level for each club. What do you think is the baseline expectation that Nashville fans should have?
We're in that weird time of year. Tom always makes fun of me for being like, it feels like all 15 teams could make the playoffs. Like everyone's had a good off season. Everyone's added an element that we thought they needed, like all these different things. So it's tough to say where it sits right now because it feels like if you look at the teams that didn't make the postseason, a lot of them have made improvements, whether it's as a coach, like Toronto with Robin Fraser, whether it's in the playing system or style. So to say like, oh, they should go for a home playoff game, I think is a little bit of a stretch right now in the Eastern Conference. But I think to be competing on the final day for a guaranteed playoff spot, which is 6 or 7 and not in the play-in, I think that's a fair expectation for the fan base. BJ Callahan got half a year last year to be a head coach for the first time, to see the league. They flipped a few roster pieces like we've talked about, but not a ton. So it's not like you're saying, they need 7 months for this team to settle in. I think it's fair to say that they should hit the ground running. They should be fairly consistent this year. And when you look at things in the end, they should be able to have a conversation and say, we're capable of being a top 6 or 7 team in the East.
Yeah, I think that's probably I mean, do you look outside of just in the league for expectations? Obviously, I mean, people can have their thoughts on the way the cup setup is, but the way it is set up now, it certainly seems to me that Nashville should be pointing at the US Open Cup and saying that is something that is attainable, that Nashville should go out, not just make a run in, but be one of the teams competing to win that. I know it's a one-off, anything can happen in one game.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, like to me, I feel like a cup run is actually very important because this team isn't a team like we hope they're in the playoffs. We hope that they, as a fan, we'd hope that they're in the playoffs and things like that. But winning that isn't really realistic. It could happen, but it isn't realistic.
Yeah.
But like the US Open Cup, considering that essentially the best teams in the league aren't playing in it,
Right.
Seems like something that Nashville fans should actually hold their, the coaching staff and players accountable for because they will be among the better teams in the US Open Cup.
Yeah. And they, it should be good atmospheres if they're home games, and that's an advantage as well. I don't know. I don't know if I'd say on paper this team's a team where you think the depth is one where it's like, oh, contending across multiple multiple competitions makes a ton of sense. But I think it's fair to say they could put energy into it. Like there could be a focus on cup weeks of like, we're going to put our best 11 out on the field in midweek and not on the weekends because 9 teams make the playoffs. So even if it's not a guaranteed spot, like you're in a play-in, you should be good enough to get there if you've built the team the way you want to. And so I think it's fair to say like an Open Cup's an expectation. And it should be probably one for every team that's in it, in that you struggled last year. So therefore you didn't get into Leagues Cup or CONCACAF. So like you have this opportunity to win this thing because you were bad, to show you're a bouncing back. And it's an opportunity that if you are good this year, won't be there next year because you won't qualify for it. So I think there's a ton of reason to think that it's one of the competitions they should focus on. We saw the energy from the Leagues Cup run. Like it's clearly the market's going to get behind the team if they're winning games and getting deeper. And they're saying it's called, quarterfinals, semifinals, we're making a final. Like that's something I think can energize a lot of people and something I think a lot of fan bases will go for. I said it on our show when we talked about the Open Cup and the way it sort of has worked out so far. I thought SKC and LAFC were a huge part of adding more clubs this year. The way they treated it, the way they talked about it, the way it mattered to their fan bases. And Sporting Kansas City's in one of its worst runs since they renamed themselves from the Wizards. And yet they made a cup final last year and had like this long spell of time where they could point towards that and build towards that and have an opportunity to win a trophy. And I think a lot of other clubs that are in it this year will look at that and say there's true value there for us as an organization to take this seriously.
Now, obviously, cheating aside, you look at Manchester City and what they've done, and a lot of people have forgotten this. What started that was a Leagues Cup win. At the very start of all that, before they won the league for the first time, the year before they won the Leagues Cup, or the League Cup. I apologize, I'm using MLS terms.
Yeah.
And that like that like kick started that sort of mentality of moving forward. And then they spent a whole bunch of money that no one else was allowed to spend. But that aside, like I think that there's something to that. Like you got off the schneid, and there's no ticking clock for 30 some odd years or whatever. Now it's how do you build off this last win? And I think a lot of Nashville fans looked at the Leagues Cup as like, all right, we're through the build phase. Like we've played in the Leagues Cup final. Everyone's watching. This is great. Right. Huge crowd. And then just fell flat afterwards. Like never fully recovered and still haven't. And so I think like there's some level of that. Like, okay, this does work. We now have silverware to prove that it works. How do you build on that? And so I do think that that's a fair point. Like it's a worthy thing to point to as being also like, this is kickstarts everything.
And let me throw out, I think one of the things like people complain about is like, oh, well, is so-and-so random fan going to understand what a US Open Cup final is? No, but so-and-so random fan doesn't know when the MLS season ends. So if you just start screaming, we're in the final in 2 weeks, come to a sold out stadium and have a fun time, they're going to completely do that. And that's the part that like I struggle with is people are like, well, they don't know where it's on TV. Nothing's on TV anymore. Like there's so many ways in which you can just choose to take something seriously and other people will react to that and they'll take it seriously. And so if you make it to a final and you win a trophy and you do it at home and it's a party and it's fun and the other team has famous players that just lost and Hani Mukhtar is lifting stuff and everyone gets to sing the country music song that I don't understand and there's guitar riffs and fireworks and all that type of stuff, that's what people want. That's what people want to go to. And like for a city that hasn't won a lot of things in big time sports, I'm not saying there's going to be a parade for it, but it's going to be acknowledged. It's going to be, people are going to be aware of it.
Nashville as a city has not won anything. Like not even won very few things. No, like the Preds and the Titans didn't come to the city until the late 90s, like 99. And since then, there's been one Super Bowl run that they lost, one Stanley Cup run that they lost, and one Leagues Cup run that they lost. So like other than that, there's nothing.
I mean, the fact that Vanderbilt's one win over Alabama to finish the season 7-6 ranks among like the top 5 moments in Nashville sports.
Yeah, it's tough.
It tells you everything you need to know.
Oh, Orlando won the NWSL championship last year. It was the first parade in the city's history. They just had never, I mean, it's obviously a newer city and they never had a pro sports team win something or a sports team win something. I don't know, UCF or college or whatever. Like people like winning. People like that stuff. It's fun.
And I think just testament to your point. I mean, like the Leagues Cup run, the group stage games, it was like Toluca and Colorado Rapids, and there's like 5 people at the stadium, including myself, covering the game. But by the time the quarterfinal rolled and Club America was there, it was like sold out, beer thrown on the field. Not that we encourage that, but there was vibe. There were vibes for sure. Some of them were scary vibes for some people who attended, but nonetheless, it's been like double the time I asked Gus to join us. So I think yes, Clay.
Well, I was just gonna say the Club America game was great. I left and we lost, and I got in the car and we won. It was what a game.
Fandom, true fandom.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, guys, we thank you so much for joining and giving us all this time. It's way more than I expected, but I also kind of at the back of my head, I was like, there's no way we're getting out of here in 30 minutes once we talk 20 minutes about like the landscape of soccer media. So there was always this. I think the local voice in MLS, you guys put a lot of emphasis on that, and I really appreciate you and Tom taking that work and we we locally love to listen to what national media are saying, and then obviously there are all these hybrid people who do a little bit national, a little bit local, and all that. But I think all of that's what you need to make this work. So thank you for all of that. I want to give you this time to give the Soccer Wise sell. I can do it if you want because I love Soccer Wise. I think it's one of the greatest things out there for American soccer fans. And yeah, the Discord is great. I don't talk as much, but every now and again I'll go look. But the sort of Excel documents or whatever they call docs, of the
Yeah.
team sheets and all that. It's been a central place for me to go for MLS content. And obviously, I'm starting to get more into the video stuff. So seeing you guys do the video stuff has encouraged us to do more video stuff, and I think that's kind
Nice.
of gonna be the catalyst for us to kind of improve our show as well. So, nonetheless, the floor is yours. Tell the people why they should subscribe, I guess.
Yeah, no, you did a good job. I appreciate that. I'm glad we could inspire a little bit. Yeah, we as we go into the season, we'll become more consistent. But myself and Tom pretty much go live on YouTube twice a week, Twitch, Twitter as well. But I don't know how often people are going there. But if you subscribe to us on YouTube, then you get the warning, which is the easiest way to do it. And myself and Jordan at least once a week, and then we probably put out 5 episodes a week, sometimes 4. So it's pretty consistent content about the sport in this region. We are talking to people we find interesting. We talked to 2 pro refs 2 weeks ago just about why they ref and how they got into it. I just put out an episode with an immigration lawyer who's specialist in sports and athletes coming to this country, mainly soccer players, and I think jujitsu is the other one. Just to talk a little bit in this off-season time of like what's the experience of these players of trying to get their families here, when they can get into training, what clubs have to consider as they choose to bring different players in. And we've had a range of people like that. And then we're talking about these leagues and teams and competitions as much as humanly possible. It is supposed to be your NBA TV or your MLB network that I don't think has really ever existed for these leagues. That's what we're trying to build and we're trying to create. So you can subscribe via Patreon. It gets you access to what you were talking about, which is our depth charts. We have on the MLS side, we have a salary table because the salaries are released. So each team has 2 tabs. One is the salary table of how much each player makes, what roster designation they're in terms of roster building, how long their contracts are, all the stuff that a Spotrac and all these other salary cap leagues have, but MLS has never had. And then we have depth charts of how teams play, how Tom and Doyle helps us with them, and myself envision how these teams are going to line up. And we do the same on the NWSL side as well. It's always for me, like I watch a game and immediately I open FOTMob to be like, just let me figure out what I'm looking at. And so I think that's a really helpful way for people to understand. And we try and help explain some of the rules in all of that as well, of just like what allocation money is, what U22 initiative is, all that other type of BS that MLS requires for you to have the degree to be able to understand the league if necessary. So come join us, listen if you get an opportunity, subscribe if you want to. But either way, any messages you send, we're reading all of them across Patreon, Discord, Blue Sky, everywhere. You can send us one, comments on YouTube to try and improve it and bring people the product that they want. But I will say what we do is not possible without outlets like yours. And there's not enough in Major League Soccer. We've talked about it over the last few weeks, and we started with this show talking about it. The landscape of coverage of the sport in this country is not where I thought it would be right now. It actually feels at times like it's taken a step back. And part of that is the reality of media and the reality of social media. But I think part of that is fans have to understand where they can help and engage, and just listening and watching and clicking, it already is enough help. And I would love to have 30 versions of what you all do across the league. And it's not the case right now. And so we are trying everything we can to try and help be a part of help building that. And I just hope as the World Cup comes along and everyone talks about the growth of the sport, that places like this and MLS and NWSL can latch on to that. Because my biggest fear is World Cup ends in the US in 2026, and the EPL is the 3rd biggest league in America. That's not exactly what I'm looking for. And so I would hope that there's an ability for the infrastructure in the sport here to continue to grow.
Well, very well said. Thank you. And in this show, we like to say, Clay, yep.
Yep.
When you agree, you just say yep and move on.
Yep.
No, this is awesome. This has been really cool. Yeah, go ahead, Clay. Send us home.
Well, I was just gonna say, we got to do our plugs too. I
Yeah,
mean, it
fair
is
enough,
our
fair enough, fair enough.
show, and
Special episode. I don't know if we were gonna
and
do
so
that.
you can so you can follow me at Clay La Soul on Instagram and Twitter. Check out the Nashville Soccer Archive. I'm supposed to have another conversation with Vandy about our physical archive. So if you have anything that you want to donate to the Nashville Physical Archive at Vanderbilt University, please reach out to me. And also, we went all show without me mentioning that Everton's won 3 in a row, so I just feel like I have to. And you should subscribe to 615 Soccer. A lot has happened. We didn't talk about Nashville's preseason win over Lexington SC on this show, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't covered. So go to 615soccer.com. You can learn everything that you didn't learn from this show about the 3-0 win over Lexington
Yes,
SC.
Cameron Lancaster plays for Lexington SC. So if you're really interested in Nashville SC history, there you go. So does Liotti, who played for Huntsville. Anyway, a lot of names out there for Lexington, but yeah, 615 Soccer, can't recommend it enough. I know I'm part of it, so it's a little biased, but look, it's where you get all your Nashville SC stuff. And then for me at Valer Shabila on Blue Sky, Twitter, whatever you call it, whatever. I'm there. Not Facebook though. Don't add me on Facebook. I don't do that. Yeah, 615soccer.com, Pharma Soccer. Give us a review. Thank you so much, David Goss, for joining us. And thank you for adding another bald head to the show. I really appreciate it. Hope everybody have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you soon.